Sorry, everyone. I was having issues with getting mute and unmute. So, like, a nice way to start off with a technical glitch and a reminder that we are in a virtual world. So, welcome everyone to this breakout session. This will be a panel presentation, and my name is Lynn Fian, and I'm the Knowledge Translation Lead from the BC Support Unit. This panel is going to be on the topic of engaging prison patient partners in research and on the impact of COVID-19 in prisons. And so over the next 55 minutes, I literally am just going to be taking the front row seat in this panel because Sophia Bartlett will and her partnership team will be presenting throughout this time. It's just been my pleasure to work with Sophia and sort of indirectly with her team to advance their capacity to meaningfully engage with people with lived or living experience of incarceration in BC and their COVID-19 research. This team has done some really amazing work with their partner engagement activities, and I really look forward to hearing more about this and about their learnings from their adventures on this together. So I do have a couple things before we start. I just want to remind people that this is a live session with the panelists. With one exception, there will be one virtual presentation. That if you have questions, please enter them in the Q&A section in the bottom of your screen so that we can start tracking and preparing for them. We will leave all questions until the end of the panel. So that's something that you can put in there in the Q&A in this. And then also a reminder that if you want to be using your social media to please use the hashtag PPF2022 to help support and promote this in our social media activities. And again, so before I pass this over to the panel to begin this conversation, I just want to take a couple minutes to introduce the speakers. It's always nice to not only see names and faces attached in the Zoom, but to get to know a little bit about who each of them are. And so I'm going to start with Sophia. She's a senior scientist for the sexually transmitted and bloodborne infections at BC Centre for Disease Control. She's also an adjunct professor at the School of Population Health at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. And for this presentation, she's the lead in two studies. One study looking at sort of blood samples, looking for the presence of antibodies for COVID-19 and people living or incarcerated, I guess they are living in BC provincial prisons, and also another study that they're working on in BC provincial prisons, looking at sort of the uptake and hesitancy around vaccines in the prisons. And she's going to be leading this panel. And she's brought along her panelists with her, and Pam Young, who is a program manager of Unlocking the Gates Services Society. And she's a peer coordinator for the Transformation Health and Justice Research Cluster at UBC as well. And her role is she's a peer advisor in the seroprevalence study, and she's also now a primary investigator in the second study that they're working on looking at vaccine uptake in BC studies. Nadine, who will be joining us virtually, is coming to us from Quebec. And she, similar to Sophia and her team, is running some very similar studies there in Quebec, examining both seroprevalence as well as vaccine use in both provincial prisons and federal prisons in BC. She's an infectious disease specialist and an assistant professor in the Department of Medicine at McGill University. So we have a nice range of people. And following Nadine's presentation, Marnie is an Indigenous harm reduction consultant. And she's worked in many different ways on many different projects with BC Centre for Disease Control, the First Nations Health Authority, and a few other projects at UBC. And she's here today in her role as she was a peer advisor in the seroprevalence study that they're going to be talking about. And last but absolutely certainly not least is Julia. And she's a qualitative researcher, and she's also a knowledge translation specialist. And she was and is the research coordinator supporting these studies that they're going to be presenting to us today. So I'm really excited about this. And so I'm going to mute myself and turn off my video and pass this over to you, Sophia.
Thanks, Lynn, and thank you to the conference organisers for the invitation to present this panel. It's really exciting. People who are incarcerated have been affected by the COVID-19 pandemic in very different ways to the way that people in the community outside of prison have been affected. So there's been increased transmission of COVID-19 within prisons, but there's also been other kind of effects for people in prison. So first of all, I'm going to open it up to Pam and really invite you, Pam, can you please describe a little bit about what it's been like for people who are incarcerated and people leaving prison during the COVID-19 pandemic?
Yes. COVID, I mean, the early stages of COVID were very stressful for people. I mean, as we in the real world were easing into everything gradually and the mandates and, you know, all the guidelines, and people in prison were kind of just cut off from the whole reality of what was going on in the community. And it was very stressful. There was lots of like misinformation and, you know, a little bit of mistrust. And I mean, it was just really challenging. There was like lack of access to services. You know, people were needing to be vaccinated to be in recovery centers. There was services that were cut. It wasn't as simple to get housing, clothing, food. Everything became more complicated, and you know, just created a lot of barriers for people. And then it's very overwhelming to be cut off from everything. I mean, the only information they were getting from the news. And yeah, it was just a really tough transition for people to, you know, just adjust to the, COVID life. And in the transitions to the community were more complicated. And it just really became difficult to access services. And yeah, so it was really overwhelming for guys, women coming out of prison and with, you know, not knowing what to expect. And I think the biggest challenges have been the isolation. People are quarantined for, you know, a couple weeks on units where they were totally cut off from everybody else. They're out, you know, hopefully 1 hour a day maximum. Sometimes that's not, they're not even getting their full hour out because there's so many people isolating. So these isolation units have been really challenging for people. They don't have access to the phone. They don't, you know, without the access to the phone, it's really hard for release planning if they plan on setting up treatment centers or recovery centers or just making plans for when they get out. And I mean, no access to family, no personal visits, you know, everything just became really challenging. And I think that's the biggest feedback that I get is that, you know, the isolation is the most difficult part of all, and just, you know, not having access to the normal services they would have before COVID.
Right. And we heard a lot of people in the community during various stages of our lockdown saying, like, this is like being in prison. And for people like yourself who are actually working with people in prison, it must have been kind of pretty frustrating for you to hear that, because you're like, actually, this is nothing like prison. You guys have no idea what they're going through right now. Hey?
Yes, yeah, it was. I mean, to hear like even celebrities or whoever, anybody comparing it to prison, and then to see what people in prison were actually facing and how much more barriers it caused for them, and how, you know, the isolation is you know, just so challenging for people, you know. So yeah, I definitely agree. It was frustrating to hear that feedback from people in the community.
Yeah, and I guess it was interesting for me as a researcher because I work in public health, right? So I'm always looking at infectious diseases. And when we first started working on the study to look at the prevalence of COVID infection among people in prison, and we were engaging with yourself and Marnie and others to look at that, you really highlighted to us that we shouldn't just be looking at the prevalence of COVID infection, that we really had to look at the other impacts of COVID on people in prison, right? Like, it was a very, very clear thing that we couldn't just look at the virus. We had to look at all of the other effects as well. Hey.
Yes, definitely. I mean, there's so many impacts that COVID's had on people in prison.
And so that's my other question for you, Pam. So, you know, why do you think that engaging with people with lived experience of incarceration on research, that's related to incarceration, particularly with respect to COVID. Why do you think this is so beneficial?
Well, I think it's so beneficial because people get to have their voices heard. I mean, that is so meaningful. As someone who participated in research in prison myself, over a decade ago, it was really empowering to be able to have my voice heard, have people like really respect or honor my experiences, and be able to have my voice heard and be able to make an impact for other people who are going through the correctional system behind them. So I mean, it's just real, and it's so beneficial in so many ways. I mean, for the researchers and for the participants. For the researchers, they can find safer research questions, the wording on research to have the biggest impact with people and be able to really engage with people in a meaningful way. And so and they can all and people in prison can also like recognize different challenges in the research, different things that they don't maybe might seem important to an academic or a researcher, but to the peers it's really not relevant. So it's really important to engage the people who are affected by the research and the people that the research involves. It's really important to engage them and get their perspective and be able to have the research done in a safer and more inclusive way. And it also helps make the research is more accurate, because by like rewording the questions to get the information that you want to get in a good way, and that it's going to have the biggest impact.
Yeah, we talk about this in the research world a lot, right? Like using lay language. But the thing is that even for myself and other researchers, when we're trying to use what we think are kind of normal words or words that people are going to understand, we don't necessarily word it in the most simple way. And so a lot of the time, what I feel like you, especially Pam, and other people with lived experience are doing is almost like giving me a translation service and making sure that what I'm saying actually makes sense for someone who's reading the questionnaire, right? Like it seems simple, but it's very important.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, people in prison, they aren't stupid. There's some very intelligent, wonderful people, but the language is often different. And, you can really connect with someone on a deeper level when you're, explaining things to them in a way that they understand and makes more sense to them.
That's so true. And I think that point that you made about making the research safer is really, really important. And actually, I think Nadine is going to speak to that a little bit now. So we can go to Nadine's presentation now, please. Thanks, Pam.
Thank you.
I think, Marian, are we able to move to that video now, please, from Nadine? Thank you.
Good morning, everyone, and I apologize I can't be with you here today. However, I'm privileged to be invited to speak as part of this panel. I've been asked to answer 2 questions during the following 15 minutes. First, how did engaging with people with lived experience of incarceration change the COVID research you are leading? Second, how do you think engaging with people with lived experience of incarceration can help with knowledge translation for COVID research and beyond? I wanted to set the stage by discussing one of the studies that I did in the past year. This was the largest correctional seroprevalence study to date, which was recently published in Clinical Infectious Diseases. We recruited 1,100 incarcerated adult men across 3 provincial prisons. We asked each of the participants to complete a baseline questionnaire, undergo serology testing, and were then compensated $10 for their participation. Due to the rapid turnaround time of the test itself, all participants received their test results prior to release from prison. As some of you may know, there are numerous research challenges that exist when conducting research in prison settings. This was exacerbated during the COVID-19 pandemic. In my opinion, convening or communicating with people with lived experience of incarceration is particularly helpful in addressing some of the ethical challenges such as confidentiality, autonomy, and privacy that may exist in prison settings that outside researchers may not have a full understanding of. At the time of study conception, we convened our Community Advisory Committee. As I have been doing research in provincial prisons for approximately 5 years, I have a well-established Community Advisory Committee that consists of 6 individuals, 4 men and 2 women, 3 of whom are white, 1 is Black, 1 is Indigenous, and 1 is of another visible minority, representative of the incarcerated Quebec provincial prison population. We always discuss study protocol and ask members of the Community Advisory Committee to review the questionnaires. Initially, we intended to approach participants in their cell and recruit systematically from cell to cell. This was initially intended because when outbreaks had occurred, public health entered the prison and did PCR testing from cell to cell. And so we wanted to replicate what had been done, tried, and tested in the prison. However, our Community Advisory Committee felt that cell-to-cell recruitment compromises confidentiality, and we thus adapted by designing a semi-private research space that was outside each of the prison sectors, where our participants were accompanied by correctional agents and where consent and questionnaire completion, as well as serology testing occurred. Secondly, we learned from our Community Advisory Committee that providing results about the serology testing in a verbal manner, also, we intended to do this from cell to cell, also compromises confidentiality. And we were advised to instead provide participants with a written memo of their test results, either positive or negative, what it meant, and do so again in the research space away from all other individuals incarcerated in prison. Finally, what we learned from our Community Advisory Committee, which was somewhat surprising, is that a diagnosis of COVID-19 is as stigmatizing as HIV or hepatitis C. Remember, we were doing serology testing and not PCR testing. So determining previous exposure to SARS-CoV-2 and not active infection. However, it was felt that there would be a lot of confusion about this difference and that there would be a great deal of stigma for those who test positive, even though it's, again, not indicative of active infection. And so we adapted by providing a study memo to all correctional employees to ensure that they understood the difference between PCR and serology testing. And there was a great deal of education that was done with potential participants at the time of recruitment to ensure that this was well understood. And so there were no consequences to them, such as isolation and massive testing if they tested positive. So in doing partner engagement, we proactively identified possible concerns for our study participants, and we adapted thereafter. I want to also touch base about data sharing. Our study was funded by the Public Health Agency of Canada through the CITF, the COVID Immunity Task Force. They created a database whereby they wanted to share certain elements in our questionnaires in a de-identified fashion publicly and would be made accessible to all national and international researchers. We again spoke with our members of the Community Advisory Committee who understood the benefits of data sharing, but felt that the database itself was a distinct and unrelated project. We initially intended to combine consenting to the study as well as consenting to data sharing in one consent form However, they felt as though it would be considered misleading to do so and not participant-centered. And so we learned something very important from our Community Advisory Committee, and that is separate ICFs or separate information and consent forms should be considered when sharing sensitive data on a vulnerable population. Secondly, I was asked to answer, how do you think engaging with people with lived experience of incarceration can help with knowledge translation for COVID research and beyond? I'll start by defining knowledge translation, taken from the CIHR. It is the diffusion, dissemination, and application of knowledge that researchers undertake once the findings from a project are available. This is typically done with knowledge users, or through knowledge users rather, who are individuals who are likely to use the knowledge generated through research in order to make informed decisions about health policies, programs, or practices, whose level of engagement in the research process may vary, and who can be any of the following individuals: policymakers, educators, community leaders, patient groups, etc., etc. One of the biggest lessons that we learned during this study is, in fact, to seek advice from the Community Advisory Committee about knowledge translation early on in the research study. We only did so after the fact, after we had accumulated all our results, and it was only at that point in time that we asked ourselves, how will we disseminate our findings to the 1,100 participants in the study? So what we did is we reconvened the Community Advisory Committee, and we asked them questions in the who, what, where, when, why fashion. We asked them, if you were a participant, what would you want to know about the study? Would you want to know who the participants were, the results, what the implications of the study were? Where should we seek to share our results? What locations in Montreal are regularly frequented by people released from prison? Unfortunately, we had not collected contact information in our baseline questionnaires, and therefore we're now seeking to try to find potential participants and locations where they may frequent following release. All the members of the community recommended community organizations for where should we seek to share our results. Why? Why should we choose some locations and not others? Why would some be not as receptive as others? And finally, how? Possibly the most important question. How would you want to receive information about a study that you participated in? It was unanimous that the desire to receive information was through a poster. And so we created these posters, English on the left-hand side, French on the right, with the title of the study, baseline characteristics in the top panel, the results with 1 in 5 testing positive, the seroprevalence by each of the individual prison sites, risk factors associated with COVID antibodies, and the implications. And a big thank you at the end of it all. We were advised to add the study logo, which we did in the left-hand corner. The colors were felt to be captivating. The icons were felt to help break up the text. And they wanted this information both in a card format as well as a poster format. And so with the help of our Community Advisory Committee, we created a list of community organizations in Montreal where release participants may frequent. Each community organization was contacted. They were asked how many cards and posters they want printed. And I'm happy to say that all these community organizations received their care package last week for dissemination. We could not have done this without our Community Advisory Committee. So what did we learn in terms of knowledge translation? As I alluded to earlier, it is absolutely essential to engage with the community early for the purpose of knowledge translation. As we all know, we have an obligation to share our findings with the research community and study participants. And I feel that this obligation is even more important when the research population is classically understudied and rarely the focus of KT efforts, such as people in prison. And so don't wait to engage with your community advisory committee at the end of the study, but do so at study conception and planning. And this may actually alter the way that you do your research. It may change the fact that in your questionnaire, you may seek to collect contact information such that you may desire contacting these individuals post-study to ensure that they actually have received the study results. Finally, KT efforts, it's important to note, they will differ based on whether the study is conducted in federal versus provincial or territorial prison. And the reason is because the sentence durations differ dramatically among those sentenced in federal versus provincial and territorial prison. In federal prison, probably don't need to collect contact information, and KT efforts can be done right then and there with participants. Whereas those who are recruited from provincial and territorial prison, you might have to get a little bit creative like we did in order to seek potential participants. And then finally, given that this population is so unique and efforts around KT are so rare, it may be a population whereby you seek to proceed with both individual and community KT efforts. And what I mean by that is, yes, individually try to contact each of your participants, but the greater community of individuals who are released from prison may also benefit to know that there is research being conducted in prison, and community organizations can be leveraged for these efforts, and hopefully also serve in a manner to help stimulate and recruit potential participants in the future. And so with that, I would like to thank all of you. I can be contacted at my email address below if you have any questions. And I hope you enjoy this panel as much as I have.
Thanks to Nadine. Unfortunately, she was not able to be here live because she's on call this week. But as she said, there's her email address in there. So people, please feel welcome to reach out to her if you have any questions specifically for Nadine. But I've got some questions for Marnie now, and leading on from something that Nadine said, she mentioned that people in prison actually nowadays are an under-researched group. So there's not a lot of research studies that are actually happening within prisons, and particularly with COVID, because the prisons have been on lockdown and it's been very challenging for other research studies to get going. And so my question for Marnie especially is, looking at changing that, how can we foster more involvement of people with lived experience of incarceration in research, both during COVID and even beyond COVID?
Thanks, Sophia. I think that quite often people, like you're saying, who are incarcerated or recently incarcerated are often left out of the conversation. And for me, well, I have lived experience, like I don't have that lived experience necessarily like during COVID. And I can imagine for people who are accessing services, bed-based services, or have been incarcerated during that period, like it's been a very different experience than most. And people who are currently incarcerated or recently incarcerated aren't getting access to the same opportunities that maybe Pam or I may have. And I mean, it makes sense because when you're first being released from prison, you're thinking like, especially for people who are released during phase one, and there's, not access to shelters or services or be able to get onto like opiate replacement therapies as easily. And people are going to be more concerned with, where are they sleeping tonight? Do they have food? Do they have access to substances for their wellness? What does that look like? And I think that there really needs to be relationships built prior to people being released. And I'm sure Pam can really speak to like how difficult that process is. I know for me, when I was working with Women into Healing, it was very difficult to build relationships with individuals who were still incarcerated because of the many, many barriers and security protocols and safety protocols. And I think that there needs to be more of an effort or a system put in place for individuals who are incarcerated to participate in these types of research studies, because I would happily step aside and center the voices of people who have been recently incarcerated. And I think it's super important to have their input and to find ways to build their capacity. And, you know, while you're incarcerated, there are substance abuse program management. There's a whole bunch of other programs that are being taught by correctional officers. And of course, people are not going to be super inclined to participate or to participate honestly. And I think that if there was a peer educator or somebody who has lived experience who can maybe help strengthen capacities for individuals with incarceration experience, that could make a significant difference. Because I know for me, being part of an original research team with Dr. Ruth Martin Elwood drastically changed the direction of my life in many different ways. And so having those opportunities while incarcerated, and then immediately after being released and being hired to be a peer research assistant, gave me opportunities that I didn't know existed, right? And that's really speaks to the importance of allyship.
Right. So the first thing is that corrections needs to make it easier and safer for researchers to be able to come in and do research projects, right? And then the second thing that you mentioned is that if researchers like me and Nadine want to be able to engage with people with experience of incarceration on our research projects, we need to invest before that to build the capacity for people while they're in prison. Like the way that you just described that, Marnie, is so great, because you kind of just showed that full cycle of like how there's parts along each of the kind of cycle, the process where we can actually do things, and that the end product is going to be more people who have lived experience of incarceration, who have experience in research and actually have the capacity, like you and Pam do, to really participate, and not participate as, you know, consultants, but actually actively come up with your own research projects, right? So that's my next question for you is, what's the next step for us to get to the place where people with lived experience of incarceration are equals in research projects and are actually driving their own research?
So I think, you know, like when you ask me that question, I think like the main thing that comes to my mind as an Indigenous person and as a person with lived experience is nothing about us without us. And this involvement can't be tokenistic, or I guess what some people like to call diversity. But for me, like I really challenge that. And I think that if you have 10 spots and you have an Indigenous person, a person of color, maybe someone from the queer community, and the other 7 are cisgendered settlers, that's not diversity, that's tokenism, right? And I shouldn't be asked to speak on behalf. Am I there as a person who uses substances, or am I there as an Indigenous person, right? So I quite often feel like people who are not informed or using best practices will see check boxes or multiple check boxes. And I think it's super important that while people who are incarcerated are under research, people who use substances are super over research. And it's really frustrating because like I've said 100 times, 100 different ways, what it is that we need. And it's frustrating if people keep asking us what we need, but they're not willing to give it to us. You know, I have a pretty high capacity today. I don't think that I'm less of a person or less capable because of my experience. I think it's what is probably going to make me the most successful in my career, right? And I think that we should be able to do things like be a PI on a grant, you know, and you look at this and you look at the systems, and we talked about this, that you have to basically be a professor at a university, but to be a professor at a university, you have to have a PhD or basically be like a 70-year-old white cisgendered male, right? And that represents like a huge proportion of academia and research. And that's not me. So how am I going to get in on that, right? And these systems are literally built to keep me out. But this started with a small opportunity for me. And now I'm pursuing, I'm in my first year in a master's in public health program. And like, I want to go into research and I want to go into epidemiology. But what is that going to look like for me? How am I going to be able to apply for grants and be a lead researcher? It's going to be a very, very difficult process and jumping through a lot of hoops. And for me, I would just love to be in a position where I can help provide opportunities and the teachings that I've received to make it slightly easier for other people who are coming through that same stream. And there are some people who are doing amazing work with the OPRA program, the overdose prevention, peer research assistants, where they are getting to choose their own research questions or breaking down the TCPS Core 2 ethics, breaking that down so that it's accessible for people with lived and living experience. So there are things that are happening, but there's always more that we could be doing.
Yeah, and you and I have talked before about the fact that, like, on this new study that we've got going now, looking at the vaccine uptake in the provincial prisons, that Pam was able to be a primary investigator on the grant application, which was really exciting. And then we were trying to figure out how we were able to do that, because usually, you have to submit the Canadian Common CV and all of those other like super, super difficult, annoying bureaucratic things that are just like out there, difficult even for academics to do. So it's just out of the reach of anyone else. But it was because it was like emergency funding that it came through during the COVID pandemic. And so it just showed us it is possible for the funding agencies to allow people who don't have, an academic appointment at a university, who aren't a professor, a stale, male and pale, they can actually open that door and let you in to be PIs on grants. But it just took a provincial public health emergency for it to happen. So the thing is, they've kind of let the secret out. They can actually change this. Now we need to actually keep pushing on it and say, this can't just be something that you do during COVID. Now you actually have to let people, even, obviously, Marnie, you're actually in the system now, right? Like, you're doing your MPH, you're going to be in that academic kind of pathway now. So you're going the traditional route and just banging at the door and going to actually be a PI, right? Whereas you're kind of highlighting that you shouldn't have to go to that length to actually be able to be involved in research, right? Like, it shouldn't require you to go do an MPH and play the game.
You have a really expensive piece of paper.
Yes,
and
right?
that's something like Pam, myself, and like other people that I've worked with for the last 10 plus years, like my PhD and my street degree cost me a lot more than I'm paying for my master's degree. I'll promise you that right now, and that form of payment came in many different ways, from loss of freedom and rights and, like dignity. There's a lot of different ways that I paid for that PhD that I have in life. And in this, like, we are very much subject matter experts, and we deserve to make a livable wage, not a honoraria or as a token of our appreciation. No, I did work. This is payment for service. I am giving you expertise that you would have not access to anywhere else. And this is work. This is payment for work. This is not a gift. Right?
It should be recognized by the funding agencies. It shouldn't be that, you can only hold grants if you're this. It should, if we're going to say that we're recognizing peer expertise, it should be across the board, right? And that's the way that we're going to foster true engagement in research at that next level, that collaboration level and the empowerment level.
Absolutely. Like, I just think that there are different perspectives. An example with one paper that I worked on with some really amazing allies and academics, we're talking about like concurrent substance use, and they're like, they just figured it was at the same time. And so, myself and other people with lived experience were like, well, are they using a stimulant and then an opiate, or a stimulant and an opiate at the same time, or an opiate and then a stimulant? And they're like, well, what do you mean? Right? Like, there's a lot of varieties there that you need to take into consideration, and the reasons will be different. Right? So there are just different things that we are able to bring to the table. And I think that like all parties are important. And I am absolutely grateful for the allies that I've had and the mentors that I've had along my journey that have opened up doors that I never knew existed and offered me seats at tables that I would never normally get to be at. And now I get to do that for other people and be like, this individual has this expertise and they need to be here for this. Right.
Yeah.
And it should never just be one of us.
That's, I think for me, the key thing here is like, how do we figure out what's the secret to having more Marnie Scows and more Pam Youngs? What's the missing ingredient so that you're not the only person who's coming out of prison and going to SPPH to do the MPH, right? Like there should be more of you. And I guess that leads me to the question that I wanted to ask Julia. So Julia, based off what we've heard from Pam and Nadine and now Marnie around, I guess we've kind of gone on a bit of a journey, right? Starting at that beginning of the spectrum on that inform and consult, and now more moving to the involve and trying to go more to collaborate and empower. How are the other studies that we're working on now in this the vaccine era of COVID-19 trying to do things differently, and how have we kind of taken some of these lessons learned and tried to run with them?
Thank you. Such an honor to get to take all the flow of what's been shared so far and get to present some of what we're currently working on. So I'm just going to very quickly share my screen because I'm going to present a little bit about the study and in that way be able to answer this question as well. Oh, here we go. All right, so as mentioned at the outset, my name is Julia Santana Parrilla. I use she, her pronouns, and I am a Spanish settler currently living on unceded territories of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, Chemanis, and Musqueam nations. And as such, I acknowledge the role of my ancestors in the colonization of what we currently know as the Americas and my role in being accountable to ongoing harms. And that's kind of the commitment that I carry through this work. So what is the ADVANCE study? So the ADVANCE study is an integrated knowledge translation project using participatory health research methods of emergent design. So that's a very fancy way of saying that we are engaging people who experience criminalization in developing our research design together in ways that at every step of the way, we are engaging in collaborative decision-making, and that each subsequent step informs the following steps. So there's this built-in flexibility such that we can be responsive to emerging priorities as identified with the people who are most impacted by the issues that we are aiming to address. So we are engaging people who are incarcerated and have experienced incarceration during COVID-19 in the co-development of peer-to-peer education strategies that promote COVID-19 vaccination. In this way, we are able to identify and respond to barriers to self-determination, trust, and health equity in setting our priorities together. And it's by involving people with living experiences in the development of the study that we are able to account for determinants of inequities such as disparate access to informed decision-making and autonomy. This study is inherently relationship focused. That's what participatory health research is. So as such, our goals are to center humility and respect in sense making of people's contexts, bridging capacity among each other, and empowering decision making. And this is guided by our principles of engagement that you can see here that include being trauma-informed, anti-oppressive, empowerment-focused, and culturally safe. This is necessary when working with people who are incarcerated such that we can make safer and more relevant decision-making with them to improve research practices as Pam had previously articulated. for us to be able to make sure that, as Pam said, voices are heard and that empowerment processes actually come to fruition, that we honor experiences that create broad impact on people's lives, it's important that we center the acknowledgement of how the systems that we are operating within are continuously contributing to these outcomes. And as Marnie said, to be able to offer the opportunities and to be able to center equitable engagement and offer opportunities to be led by those who have the expertise in the experiences that we're hoping to have an impact on, these are necessary reflections.
It's really interesting because there's some discussion happening in the chat box just around how rigid and racist the structures around the correctional system are. And it's something that Julia and I and others, when we have our team meetings, we actually kind of have discussion every week around, like, are we part of the system? Are we contributing to the kind of racist colonial processes that happen within corrections? And we often reflect on our roles as part of that. And I think that that's another important aspect of this work. So, like, the very central part, and this is what we've heard through all of the engagement that we've had with peer advisors like Pam and Marnie, who have now actually evolved to be more part of the research team, actually shaping the research, really sharing with us that, you know, part of the vaccination campaigns in BC, and maybe this is happening in the community as well, but it's, you know, there's been trust that's been damaged, right? And so how do you get people to trust the information that they're being given when they're inside an inherently dangerous, racist and colonial kind of system? It's a very almost contradictory kind of thing to set out to do. So it's been a very difficult study conceptually, actually, to kind of position, but it's also been difficult in other ways. So Julia, maybe you could comment a little bit on some of the challenges that we've had in taking this approach, where, you know, it has been emergent. So it means that, you know, we had to come up with a draft questionnaire to go through to the ethics board, but then, you know, that questionnaire had to get really, really refined through the input from Pam and other peer advisors. And so, you know, we've had this constant revision and iteration and other challenges. So yeah, please, I take this as a debrief opportunity.
Okay, well, before I get into that, I'm just going to give people a little bit of context in terms of how the study has been designed to be undertaken. So, oh my goodness, wrong way. Excuse me, pardon me. That's an accidental sneak peek at what's coming. What's happening? Here we go. Okay, everything's fine. All right. So the way that we've set out the project is to be undertaken in 4 phases. So in the first phase, the idea was to be able to undertake virtual focus groups with, originally what we wanted to do was engage people who are currently incarcerated. However, one of the challenges, which Nadine also spoke to, is just how difficult it is to access people who are incarcerated, particularly during COVID, given how their operational capacity has been severely restricted, because they're just trying to continuously respond to this state of flux that is COVID. So thankfully, we were able to hold a virtual focus group with peer support workers from Unlocking the Gates Services Society, of which Pam is the program manager. And during that conversation, we were able to talk about setting priorities for engagement. So that included our survey questionnaire questions. So basically how we're asking the questions, as well as what sense there is in asking the questions we were wanting to ask. And then also approaches to engagement, such as the language being used, as well as how to get people's attention, how to entice people into being a part of this project with recruitment materials. And really a key lesson there was make things as simple as straightforward as possible. The following phase, which we're currently trying to mobilize, is phase 2, which is engagement phase. And this phase, the idea is that we will be garnering and collecting a lot of information about attitudes and beliefs about COVID-19, about COVID safety, and about vaccination. And with that, we will be able to inform phase 3, in which we will be engaging people who are currently incarcerated in a series of working groups to co-develop peer-to-peer education strategies. During this phase, the first half will be dedicated to setting priorities together, which will include a lot of the how aspect of everything, not just the what. And then we will engage unit representatives in becoming peer educators, such that each one will be able to engage people on their living units in conversations about COVID-19 and COVID-19 vaccination. And then lastly, in phase 4, we will hold evaluation focus groups with the peer educators to talk about barriers and facilitators to activating the peer-to-peer education strategies on their living units and make some revisions. So with that said, this project is responding to a public health emergency, and it requires us to be able to work quickly, but we have experienced significant delays due to how COVID is continuously throwing wrenches into the gears. But before I move on, I'd like to share the, oh no, sorry, this is actually moving on. So the barriers that we have encountered are a lot having to do with the systems that we are working within, so academia and corrections. In the world of academia, we've had a lot of difficulty with ethics applications. Within systems of academia, there's a lot of structures in place in terms of who has the expertise, who can make the decisions, as well as this almost like overcautiousness, because there is no real understanding of how things are in incarceration contexts. And so there's this real hesitance in terms of whether you will be doing good work with people who are incarcerated. So there's just been various iterations and amendments having to be made, not only because of the conversations that we're having with our advisory network of peers, but also because of the feedback from ethics in terms of just continuously having to defend the decisions that we are making. And because many of the decisions we are making are informed by people who have experience of incarceration, there's that extra level of hesitance there. And then the other impacts are, like I said, the operations within corrections and the minimized capacity there, given the fact that they have lower staff, they have staffing issues, there's been COVID outbreaks, and so facilitating research activities has been quite difficult. Thankfully, though, we have been able to respond to these delays thanks to the relationships that we have. So we've been able to kind of hit the pause button and take this opportunity to reflect and engage our collaborators, our co-investigators, and stakeholders in general in conversations about, okay, we have this continuously restricting timeline, but we want to be able to maintain the integrity of our participatory methods and centering people's lived experiences and setting priorities here. So we've been able to take a pause and be able to put our heads together and think of alternative strategies to be able to undertake this work. And with that, again, other iterations with ethics. So it's just been continuous. We received the funding in April and we weren't able to start April of last year, and we weren't able to start phase 1 until February of this year. So it's been really quite difficult. And
I think we actually have to
wrap up.
up. Yeah, we're at time. I feel like
Okay.
we could talk about for.
Okay.
I want to thank Pam, Marnie, Julia, yourself, and of course Nadine as well for sharing this. I think this is just a call to action for people who are doing research, particularly if it's related to people who use substances or other people who are criminalized, to really think about engaging with people who are in prison, because as Marnie and Pam have both shared, it has this really extended benefit that actually echoes beyond the study, in increasing the capacity of those people to participate in research going on, and really just actually giving them the opportunity to have their voices heard. It's not just going to improve the research that you're doing, but it's potentially going to improve other aspects of those people's experience in prison and beyond. And it's really, a lot of challenges spoken about, but even during COVID, we were able to actually get into correctional centers via Zoom and Microsoft Teams. So, there is this opportunity to use technology to increase access to research. So thank you to the conference organizers. Thank you everybody who joined on this panel. We saw so many really amazing comments and really appreciated those words of encouragement, especially from Elder Roberta. Thank you. And over to you, Lynn.
Great, thank you. I have nothing further to add, other than to say that I've just been so motivated and madly taking notes, and just really inspirational. So many amazing things you guys have brought up, and the work that you're doing is so important. And I look forward to continuing to help join you in this adventure as we move forward. And again, thank you. So I think we'll just have a few wrap up moments that we are moving into lunch. And don't forget to do the poster presentations, the e-posters, and join them, because there's some amazing posters there as well. So thank you, everybody, and we'll see you again soon in the next sessions. Research, so that's good. So really, really nice to hear. So take your break, a well-deserved break, and hopefully we'll be able to see you in further sessions. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Lynn. Thanks, Pam and Marnie. I'll be in touch with you both if there's anything to follow up. Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.